I spend a lot of time in martial arts circles, and there's this one interaction that repeats itself, almost like a ritual, you know. Whenever I practice with friends from Europe or the US, our teacher will demonstrate something. He might make a claim, let's say crows are white. And in that dojo, in that specific moment, well, crows are white.
Okay.
We all just absorb it. We practice the form. We follow the hierarchy. There's a kind of shared understanding. It requires no words. We just follow the lead.
Right. A sort of implicit agreement in that context.
Exactly. But later, almost inevitably, one of my foreign friends will pull me aside. They always lower their voice a bit. Hey, Les, do you? Personally, agree with him about the crows.
Okay.
And they seem genuinely confused when I just sort of smile. They see my silence in front of the teacher and they translate it as total personal agreement. Like to them, my teacher and I are one mind.
They're mapping their own cultural interpretation onto your silence?
Precisely. And I'm left thinking, honestly, I have no idea what he's on about. I'm just here to practice. That gap in understanding, that moment where my silence means one thing to me, respectful observation maybe, and something completely different to them. Well, it gets at the heart of something I've been thinking about for a long time. That story really highlights a profound cultural gap, doesn't it? The moment where silence stops being, just an absence of sound and becomes an active communication tool, but one that's easily misunderstood.
Absolutely.
So today we're taking that subtle difference, the interpretation of a pause, a nod, or just not giving a personal opinion, and we're looking at how it plays out in these big organizational structures, specifically comparing Japan and the Western world, particularly the US.
Exactly. What we're really analyzing here are the underlying systems, the deep established hierarchy, the way implicit understanding works, the core cultural values, all the things that govern whether silence is interpreted as agreement or respect or maybe confusion or even rejection.
It's like the invisible architecture beneath the conversation.
That's a great way to put it. Our mission today is to unpack that social and structural architecture. We'll focus specifically on how these dynamics play out in really high-stakes environments like business negotiations and team collaborations between Japanese and Western organizations. Because this invisible architecture, it doesn't just change the meaning of silence, it kind of changes the meaning of everything.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation. The thing that frames this whole discussion, really. Edward Hall's distinction between high-context and low-context cultures.
Right.
You mentioned Japan as the textbook example of high context.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean in practice? Beyond just, people not using a lot of words.
Well, it means that meaning is overwhelmingly conveyed implicitly. It relies really heavily on nonverbal cues, shared history, shared knowledge, and just a deep understanding of the context built up over time.
Because the culture's been pretty homogenous historically.
Exactly. So there's this high level of assumed shared background. It's like a kind of social shorthand, the actual verbal communication. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
That makes me think of that traditional saying, hear 1, understand 10.
Precisely.
You're expected to kind of fill in the blanks, right?
Yeah.
Using the context, the speaker's rank, the history of your relationship, not just the literal words.
Absolutely. The communication channels they use in a high context setting are, they're vast and layered. They're using eye contact, posture, body language, and silence itself as information carriers.
Okay, so contrast that with the US and most Western cultures. We're generally low context.
Right. In low context cultures, clarity is king. Communication needs to be direct, explicit, literal.
If I want you to know something, I have to spell it out.
Pretty much. The social contract is built on that explicit delivery of information. There's less reliance on shared background or reading minds.
Okay, in this difference, it fundamentally changes how silence is processed. You mentioned there's research on this.
Oh, yeah. It's fascinating stuff. When they compared Japanese and U.S. subjects, the Japanese consistently interpreted silence as highly active and communicative.
Active. How so?
It carried symbolic meaning. The listener was expected to actively engage with that silence, to figure out the underlying message or maybe the deliberation process happening. It's treated as a deliberate strategy.
So it's not just a pause in the conversation, it's like an action item for the listener.
Precisely. It could signal careful thought, profound respect for the issue's complexity, or maybe even a difficult internal disagreement that they can't voice publicly yet.
But for the U.S. subjects, silence was seen differently.
Yeah, much less functionally.
Okay.
For Americans, silence tends to be interpreted as more positive maybe, like internal reflection, or frankly, sometimes just empty space that needs to be filled quickly if the conversation stalls.
Right, the stereotype of Americans needing to talk all the time.
Well, there's some truth to the preference for explicit talk, but the key is the Japanese view of silence is far more functional. It's doing heavy informational lifting in the background.
And when those two communication systems collide, say, in a boardroom negotiation, the results can be, well, pretty disastrous pretty quickly.
Instantly catastrophic sometimes.
Let's talk about that negotiation silence anecdote. That really drives it home.
Right. So imagine this scenario. We've seen it happen. An American software company is negotiating a big deal, maybe infrastructure software, long-term contracts, with Japanese executives in Tokyo.
High stakes.
Very high stakes. The Americans present their final terms. Everything's detailed, tech specs, pricing. They finish, lean back, maybe expect some questions, a bit of pushback.
And instead?
They get silence, but not just a beat or two. Profound, prolonged silence. Like 45 seconds, maybe even a full minute.
Which to the Americans feels like an eternity and a bad sign.
Exactly. For them, that silence instantly translates to catastrophic rejection. Or maybe they've deeply offended someone, they feel the clock ticking, their deal evaporating, panic starts to set in.
You can picture it. The team leader starts sweating, shuffling papers.
Looking desperately at his colleagues, yeah. And then he starts talking again. He interrupts that quiet processing time. And he starts offering concessions before anyone has even objected. He leans forward, all anxious. Look, he says, if the licensing fee is too high, we can knock 10% off the service agreement right now, just to show good faith.
Wow. Giving away money without being asked.
Exactly. And what was the crucial misinterpretation here? What was really going on?
Well, the Japanese executives weren't rejecting the offer, were they?
Not at all. They were engaging in respectful collective processing, considering the long-term implications for their company, maybe even for generations, that profound silence. It was a signal that they were taking the proposal with the utmost seriousness.
Okay. So the Americans' impatience?
Their impatience, their interruption, it was immediately seen as breaking the harmony of that moment. But even more importantly, it signaled a lack of sincerity, a lack of trust in their own initial offer. Why backtrack so fast if the deal was presented honestly in the first place?
So in trying to be flexible, they actually signaled that they weren't trustworthy.
Precisely. They failed the trust test. And the Japanese firm. They ultimately passed on the deal. It wasn't even about the financials anymore. The relationship itself, the trust, had been damaged because the American team just couldn't read the room. They couldn't respect the process, couldn't respect the silence. Now, to really get why communication often needs to be so indirect, especially in business settings over there, we have to look at some foundational concepts. These are the things that enforce harmony and, crucially, prevent public confrontation.
Okay.
And this system of, let's call it self-regulation, it really centers on two key ideas, Han and Tate-mei.
Right. I've heard these terms. Han, Hano. That's like your true feelings,
Mei.
Your personal opinions, desires, the stuff you generally keep hidden, or at least private.
Exactly. That's the internal reality. And Tate-mei is the opposite. It's the public facade, the polite behavior, the socially acceptable opinions you display, because they're appropriate for the situation, for your relationship to the group, your position in the hierarchy.
So it's more than just manners.
Oh, much more. This separation is considered a functional necessity, a critical lubricant, you might say, for group cohesion.
A lubricant. How so?
Well, in a society historically built on collective effort, like farming villages, maintaining social order and preventing any potential loss of face or public argument is absolutely paramount. So internal restraint becomes mandatory. You simply cannot prioritize your personal hone over the needs of the collective Tate-mei.
I can see how that separation would be intensely frustrating for someone coming from a low-context culture.
Yeah.
Especially cultures that really value, radical honesty or transparency.
Absolutely. We often interpret Tate-mei as insincere or even two-faced.
Yeah.
And that's the danger of just looking at it from the outside. What foreigners often miss is that Tate-mei is understood internally as necessary situational behavior. It's a vital social tool. The true feelings, the Han, they're only revealed after maybe long years of building trust, often in private settings, maybe after work, sometimes helped along by alcohol.
So revealing your home too early or in the wrong place?
It's a catastrophic social error, just disastrous.
So, okay, let's say you did publicly challenge your senior manager using your true feelings, your honey. What's the actual consequence? It sounds like it's more severe than just being seen as rude.
Oh, much more severe. It results in a serious loss of face. And we need to be clear, loss of face isn't just about personal embarrassment.
Right.
It's a kind of public failure that severely damages long-term relationships. And critically, it reflects badly on the group you represent, your team, your department, your company, not just you as an individual. It suggests you lack the self-control, the maturity needed to navigate social complexity.
And this necessity of performing tape-may, of maintaining that public face, it's enforced by an incredibly rigid structure, right? The vertical hierarchy, which you mentioned has deep Confucian roots.
Absolutely. That structure dictates almost every single interaction. Hierarchy isn't just a corporate thing. It's organized around all these vertical relationships. Customer and vendor, senior and junior. The senpai-kuhai relationship is huge. It permeates business, education, social life, everything.
And this structure dictates really practical things, doesn't it? Like seating arrangements, even how you address someone.
Precisely. Hierarchy determines who speaks last in a meeting. It determines where people sit, for instance. The highest-ranking person always sits in the kamisa, the seat of honor, which is usually the one farthest from the door.
Okay.
And crucially, yes, how people are addressed. This is where keigo, or respectful language, comes in.
Keigo often gets mentioned quickly, but it sounds like it's a really complex system, almost like a technology for enforcing hierarchy.
It really is. It's not just throwing in some polite words. It's a whole grammatical system with 3 main registers that physically, or rather linguistically, manifest the hierarchical difference between speakers.
3 registers.
Yeah. You have Sankaigo, which is honorific language. It elevates the person you're talking to or about. Then there's Kenjugo, which is humble language. It lowers yourself or your group. And finally, Tainego, which is just generally polite language, signaling formality, like using masu endings.
Wow. So using the wrong register isn't just a slip of the tongue.
No, it's an instant public signal of disrespect, even if it's totally unintentional.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say a junior employee is talking to a client. If he uses humble language, Kenjugo, when referring to his own company's product, that's correct. But if he then accidentally uses honorific language, Sankaigo, to refer to himself or his own actions.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. He's instantly signaled a catastrophic lack of understanding of his place. It reflects poorly on his maturity, his training, and by extension, his entire company. Keigo forces everyone to constantly acknowledge and perform their place in the hierarchy.
So this structure, it naturally leads to really high conformity, doesn't it? If consensus and group harmony are the absolute top priorities, then expressing strong individual disagreement seems like, well, an existential threat to the system.
It absolutely is perceived that way. Individuals are often advised, sometimes explicitly, to yield if they're in opposition, just to maintain that group consensus, to dissent strongly, especially publicly. That risks being seen as immature, selfish, or deliberately challenging the necessary harmony.
There's no real social benefit to being the lone wolf, the outlier.
None at all. In fact, you show character and respect by finding ways to integrate your perspective into the collective consensus, even if that means fundamentally compromising or yielding your personal hon. That's seen as mature and responsible. Okay, so this strong emphasis on consensus and hierarchy, it fundamentally shapes how organizations actually get things done.
Right.
Especially decision-making.
Right. In the West, we tend to think of decisions as top-down. The boss decides, tells people what to do, and expects quick execution.
Exactly. Individual authority, speed. In Japan, though, decisions are generally bottom-up. They're holistic, meaning they consider the whole system, and they are intensely consensus-based. It's all about the group orientation.
It sounds like a recipe for incredibly slow decision-making.
It can be.
But maybe also incredibly resilient decisions once they're made.
That's absolutely the trade-off. And the formal manifestation of this collective approach is something called the ringi system.
The ringi system, okay.
This usually involves a written proposal, the ringi show. It's not just sent to the boss for a quick signature. Instead, it circulates systematically through the entire hierarchy. It might start with a lower-level manager and then move slowly upwards.
And everyone who gets it has to do something with it.
Yes. Everyone who receives it is expected to read it, review it carefully, and then physically affix their personal stamp, their henko to it.
A henko, right? That's the personal seal instead of a signature.
Exactly. And putting your henko on it signifies that you, as an individual, have reviewed the proposal. And crucially, even if you had some private reservations, you agree that this is the best course of action for the group. You might make minor notes or suggestions, often in red ink, along the way.
So by the time that proposal reaches the top executive,
by that time, every single person who will be affected by the decision has reviewed it and personally sealed their agreement onto the document. It ensures total shared ownership.
in shared responsibility, I guess.
Yes, and that's a key function, distributing responsibility. If the decision later turns out to be a spectacular failure, no single person is solely accountable.
Ah, interesting.
Accountability is diffused across everyone who stamped it. This protects individual careers while ensuring the group can still move forward collectively. The obvious drawback, of course, is that this process can be glacial. It can take weeks, sometimes even months, for relatively minor issues.
But even this formal ringi system, it's often preceded by something else, right? This informal step called nimawashi.
Yes, nimawashi. This is arguably the truly crucial step.
What does it mean literally?
Nimawashi actually comes from gardening. It means root binding, carefully preparing the roots of a plant before you transplant it to make sure they aren't damaged in the move.
Okay.
In a business context, it means that the actual decision is often solidified through lots of informal, usually face-to-face discussions before the formal ringi process even begins, or before the official meeting.
So the big meeting isn't where the debate happens or the decision is made?
Not usually, no. The meeting is often where the decision, already reached through nimawashi, is formally ratified and announced.
Why do it that way?
Nimawashi ensures that the proposal is, as they say, protected from damage. It means there won't be any embarrassing public disagreements in the formal meeting, no sudden confrontations. It guarantees the official decision-making process will be smooth and harmonious.
So that's where the real politicking happens, in these behind-the-scenes chats.
Absolutely. This is where the true politics and negotiations within the organization happen, often in small, private discussions, maybe one-on-one chats, maybe corridor conversations, or even over drinks after work. It's all about building that consensus quietly beforehand.
And this clash of decision-making models, it becomes brutally apparent when you drop a Western manager into a Japanese structure. Like in that anecdote about leadership clashes.
Yeah.
The one with Sarah.
Right, Sarah. The American manager transferred to lead a Japanese technical team. She comes in championing all these Western corporate ideals, flat hierarchy, radical candor, the famous open door policy.
Yeah.
She stands up and says, "My door is always open. If you think my ideas are flawed, tell me. Challenge me. I want your honest feedback."
And how does the team react?
Well, they nod enthusiastically. They seem receptive. They work incredibly hard. They deliver projects flawlessly, on time, no complaints. But her office door, it remains completely silent. No one walks in to offer feedback or challenge her ideas.
And she interprets this as
failure. She thinks they're disengaged. Maybe they don't respect her. Maybe they're even resentful of her approach. She feels like she's not connecting.
Wonder from the team's perspective.
From their perspective, their silence and their perfect, uncomplaining execution, that was their expression of commitment. That was their profound respect for her role as leader. They were fulfilling the tape-may role of the devoted employee.
How so?
By protecting the group's harmony and protecting her reputation as the leader by not publicly challenging her or pointing out flaws. That would cause embarrassment for everyone.
So she was essentially demanding Han their true personal opinions without having put in the time, maybe years, to build the deep trust required to safely deliver that kind of direct feedback.
That's the fundamental mistake. Exactly. They were likely waiting for her to build that trust through quiet, consistent competence, through relationship development over time, through showing she understood their ways. Publicly criticizing the boss, especially a new one, that risks severe loss of face for the person doing it, for the boss, for the whole team. Their engagement was defined by silent, perfect execution, not by verbal participation in brainstorming or critique sessions.
And this difference extends to how feedback itself is given, right? Western feedback often uses that sandwich method.
Yeah, the positive, negative, positive approach, trying to soften the blow of the criticism.
Right. How does it work typically in a Japanese context?
Well, in a Japanese structure, feedback, especially corrective feedback, often avoids direct confrontation altogether. And when it is given, it tends to focus almost exclusively on the areas for improvement. Positive aspects might be completely ignored.
Really? Why ignore the good work?
The thinking is often, well, if the work is already good, why waste time discussing it? The focus must be on the failure point, the area needing correction, because that's seen as the most effective way to help the individual, and therefore the company, improve. It's about striving for perfection.
So if you complain, hey, I never hear anything positive, what's the likely response?
You might hear something related to the idea that the customer is like a god, okyakusama, kamisama desu. The implication being, well, God doesn't need to thank people for just doing their job properly.
Wow, okay.
The expectation is that your motivation comes from the inherent quality of the work itself and contributing to the good of the group. And if constructive criticism absolutely must be given, especially upwards to a superior, it's almost always done indirectly. Maybe through an intermediary, maybe very subtly hinted at, to preserve harmony and avoid direct confrontation.
And the person who takes the care to deliver that message indirectly is actually seen positively.
Yes, they're perceived as professional, mature, and skilled in navigating complex social dynamics. Directness, in that context, can be seen as crude or unskilled. Now, even when everyone's supposedly speaking the same language, maybe English, this high-context style introduces massive potential for error, purely through ambiguous responses, through what the Japanese call aimai.
Ambiguity, right? And the classic, maybe the ultimate offender here, is the word yes.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a critical distinction to understand. In many situations, yes or hi in Japanese may only mean I hear you, or I understand the words you were saying.
It doesn't automatically mean I agree with you, or I commit to this.
Exactly. It's often more like an acknowledgement that the communication channel is open and the message was received. Imagine a Western team feeling great, thinking they have a solid verbal agreement because they heard yes 10 times in a meeting.
Only to find out later the negotiation wasn't actually concluded at all.
Precisely. That failure to distinguish comprehension from commitment causes immediate friction and deep misunderstandings.
And then there are the more passive, or maybe polite, forms of rejection. Things like, we will consider it.
Right. That type of response, or maybe phrases like, that would be difficult, or I'll think about it. These are very often deployed as a tactful, indirect no.
Why not just say no?
Because a direct no can cause offense, create friction, damage the harmony. The indirect refusal allows the speaker to end the discussion politely without a direct confrontation. The key indicator is what happens next.
If nothing happens.
If you don't receive specific follow-up actions or concrete dates or further questions shortly after hearing, "we'll consider it," then the answer was almost certainly negative. You have to read the lack of action as the message.
So as a foreigner, you really have to broaden your communication radar. It's not just listening to the words, but watching what people don't say and what they do or don't do afterwards.
Absolutely. And you have to constantly clarify subjective language. When a Japanese counterpart says, "this is urgent," or "please complete this soon," they're applying their own cultural context, their own timeline to that word.
And their urgent might be very different from your urgent.
Exactly. In a low-context environment, urgent might mean, within 3 hours. In their context, given other priorities and processes, it might mean by the end of the week or even longer. You can't assume.
So you have to force the specificity.
You must. Always try to seek clarification using numerical or measurable terms. Ask for a specific deadline. By when exactly do you need this? Ask for a precise quantity. How many units are considered enough? Otherwise, that holistic, high-context interpretation just takes over and you risk major misalignment.
Okay, now what about tone? This is fascinating. You mentioned that sometimes Japanese speakers misuse English phrases they learned as polite.
Yes, this creates some really interesting, often quite tense communication gaps. It often stems from how English is taught in schools there.
And the classic example you gave was had better.
That's a prime one. Many speakers have reported being taught that had better is somehow grammatically more polite or maybe just more emphatic than simply using should.
But in English, you had better. Sounds quite strong.
It often sounds like a firm warning, or a threat, or an ultimatum, depending on the context and tone. You had better attend the meeting. It doesn't sound like a polite suggestion.
So this teaching failure leads to real misunderstandings.
Serious ones. I heard an anecdote from a foreign business person who was completely baffled when a Japanese colleague told him, quite earnestly, "You had better change your way of thinking."
Ouch.
Right. The speaker only intended to say, "I sincerely think you might be mistaken. Perhaps consider this alternative." The intent was polite correction, but the delivery, using had better, came across as incredibly adversarial.
And just the basic issue of intonation can cause problems too, right? Because Japanese uses pitch differently than English.
Yes, Japanese generally uses less dynamic pitch stress within sentences compared to English. So a simple question like, "what is the objective?" asked with a relatively flat intonation might sound perfectly fine, just seeking clarification.
But if the stress falls incorrectly?
If, perhaps due to less familiarity with English stress patterns, it comes out as, so what is the objective? With heavy stress on what, it can instantly sound like harsh criticism, like you're expressing impatience or annoyance or doubting the whole purpose of the task. The intent might be neutral, but the perceived tone is negative.
We also need to touch on paralanguage and nonverbal cues.
Right.
Laughter, for instance. It's not always about amusement, is it? You mentioned aisuare.
Right, polite laughter.
What does that signal?
It can signal a range of things, actually. It might be confusion. I don't understand what you just said. It could be embarrassment. Perhaps they feel they asked a silly question or you put them on the spot. Or it can function as a kind of diplomatic disagreement, a very indirect no.
So if you're explaining something and your Japanese counterpart suddenly laughs awkwardly, what should you do?
Well, the advice is often counterintuitive. Don't immediately try to explain the concept again, but more complexly. They might be laughing precisely because they didn't understand the English, and adding complexity just increases their embarrassment.
So what's the better approach?
Maybe pause, wait a beat, or perhaps paraphrase your original point much more simply and clearly. Give them an easy out without making them feel ashamed for not understanding.
Okay. What about those sounds people make? That sharp intake of breath through the teeth. It's quite distinct.
Yes, that sucking sound. It often signals difficulty. It might mean partial disagreement or that the request is complicated for them or simply, I can't easily say yes to this right now.
So it's not usually a flat no.
Rarely a complete firm rejection on its own, but it's definitely a red flag. It signals there's a problem, an obstacle, something they're reluctant to voice directly. You need to maybe probe gently, ask clarifying questions to find out what the difficulty is.
And we also see this complexity in nonverbal displays of respect, like the bow, the ojigi.
Oh, the bow is a perfect visual manifestation of the hierarchy we talked about. It's not just a simple nod.
Yep.
The depth of the bow correlates directly to the status difference between the individuals involved. A junior person bowing to a senior person must bow lower, and crucially, they must wait for the senior person to start straightening up before they begin to rise.
So timing matters too.
Immensely. To straighten up too early or to bow too shallowly relative to the other person's status, that's an instant nonverbal signal of disrespect.
Huh.
The bow is constantly reinforcing the social structure without a single word needing to be spoken.
And finally, just circling back to silence itself, you cautioned against the Western impulse to immediately fill the void.
Yes, because as we discussed, prolonged silence in that context can often be a positive signal. It can signal trust.
How so?
It can mean something like, I trust you, I respect you, and we don't need to over-explain or fill this space with unnecessary words right now. We understand each other on a deeper level. By immediately reacting with more talk, more explanations, more questions, you demonstrate impatience. And you can actively break that unspoken bond, that quiet understanding.
And in a high-context culture where trust is absolutely paramount for any future dealings.
Interrupting that silent deliberation or that moment of shared understanding can be interpreted as a fundamental breakdown in communication. A deep lack of respect for the other person, for the process, for the time needed to operate as a cohesive unit. It can really damage the relationship. You know, I want to look a bit closer now at how these fundamentally different views on group harmony versus explicit communication, on the individual versus the collective play out when things go wrong. Specifically, when dealing with individual failure or public scandal, this really reveals a deep philosophical difference regarding individualism.
Okay, let's use that scandal example you mentioned, the one involving a high-profile individual in an entertainment company who did something deeply problematic.
Right. So when this news broke, if you looked at Western media forums, online discussions, the reaction was immediate and collective.
What did that look like?
There were widespread demands to pull his entire show off the air immediately, boycott the entire production company, essentially cancel the whole organization associated with him.
So the individual's failure was seen as contaminating the entire group.
Exactly. The company's silence or perceived slowness to react was widely interpreted as complicity. This necessitated loud public statements, condemnations, firings, purification rituals, essentially to reinforce shared societal values and show the group was still unified against the transgression.
But the reaction in Japan was quite different, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It focused much more on isolating the failure.
Precisely. The predominant view seemed to be, the failure belongs to the person. The individual owns their mistake, and the organization, the larger entity, should not suffer unnecessary functional damage because of it.
So the argument was, why should the scriptwriters, the lighting crew, the other actors, the caterers, the whole logistical framework, Why should they all lose their jobs because of one person's actions?
Exactly. The group, the larger functional entity that produces the show, should be protected by isolating the failure to the individual responsible. The Western model often demands the organization publicly confess and cleanse itself to reinforce collective unity. The Japanese model tends to isolate the problem to the person, allowing the group, the system, to continue its essential function relatively unharmed.
That's a really stark contrast in how responsibility is viewed and managed.
It is.
Now, this cultural structure, the rigid hierarchy, the overwhelming emphasis on the group, while it's clearly highly functional for building consensus and maintaining harmony, it seems to be having some, well, concerning impacts on the modern Japanese workforce itself. You mentioned extremely low levels of employee engagement.
Yeah, the statistics are genuinely worrying, especially when you think about global competitiveness. One recent, widely cited study showed that a shocking 41% of Japanese respondents were classified as disengaged at work.
41%, that's huge.
It is, and maybe even more telling, only 2% were categorized as highly engaged. 2%. This points to a profound, deep-seated malaise within the traditional corporate world there.
And what's identified as the root cause for this widespread disengagement? Beyond just, general cultural conservatism.
A lot of it seems rooted in the traditional human resources structure, particularly in large companies. When people join a company, especially straight out of university, they're often hired by the company for life, not for a specific job role.
Okay.
They are essentially treated as interchangeable parts, portable assets that the company can assign to various jobs or departments, often regardless of their specialized education, their personal interests, or even their innate talents.
So you could have studied engineering but end up in sales.
Easily. And employees are expected to demonstrate loyalty by cheerfully accepting these assignments, even if they hate the work, or if it requires being transferred thousands of miles away from their family.
And this leads to that infamous loyalty test you mentioned earlier, Tanshinfunen.
Yes. Tanshinfunen. It's the practice of transferring a married employee, usually the husband, to a distant location, often requiring them to live alone for years while the family remains behind in the family home.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, and it's often framed implicitly or explicitly as the ultimate test of loyalty to the company. It demonstrates that the worker places the company's needs far above their personal life, their family life. It powerfully reinforces the idea that the individual must be prepared to sacrifice everything for the collective entity that is the company.
And you noted there's sometimes a darker interpretation of why companies might do this, not just structural inertia.
Well, according to some observations from people working closely within these systems, there is a view that some companies might almost purposefully keep employees from doing the work they genuinely want to do.
Why would they do that?
Because, in this view, they deeply value the loyalty demonstrated by a worker who continues to perform flawlessly, diligently, without complaint, even after they've been denied their preferred career path or endured a punishing transfer like Tanshinfunen. This enduring, suffering loyalty, it's sometimes described chillingly as beautiful. The suffering itself becomes proof of the dedication.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sounds like an absolutely terrifying test of character and dedication, especially, I imagine, for younger workers looking at this system.
And it leads directly to a compelling hypothesis about that low engagement.
Yeah.
That the resistance to fully engaging, to fully committing, might be fueled by a legitimate rational fear. A fear of the extreme level of sacrifice that the traditional system seems to demand if you do fully commit.
The fear of karoshi.
Exactly. The fear of karoshi death from overwork.
We hear that term karoshi, but its cultural weight must be immense.
It truly is. This isn't some hypothetical risk. It's a legally and socially recognized societal crisis in Japan. Karoshi refers specifically to death due to occupational stress, often a stroke or heart attack, following incredibly grueling work hours, sometimes sustained periods of 100 hours or more of overtime per month.
It's legally recognized.
Yes. The very existence of established legal recognition and even systems for compensatory payments to families whose loved ones are certified as having died from overwork, it just underscores the sheer gravity of this issue. This fear, this very clear and present demonstration of the ultimate sacrifice the system can demand, it almost certainly fuels some of the younger generation's reluctance to commit fully to that traditional all-consuming work structure.
So they're rationally choosing to preserve their private self, their hun, from the overwhelming demands of the group tatme in its most extreme form.
That seems like a very plausible interpretation of the low engagement figures, yes. It's a form of self-preservation in the face of potentially extreme consequences. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Well, this deep dive has certainly shown us that what we observe on the surface, whether it's a smile, a nod, a business decision, or, yeah, just a long, drawn-out silence, it's all governed by these invisible but incredibly powerful, deeply ingrained social and ethical architectures. We started with that simple observation in a martial arts dojo that crows are white for a moment. And we've ended up seeing how massive global business deals can hinge entirely on the ability or inability to read these unspoken high-context cues.
Absolutely. And I think the essence of this whole cross-cultural gap, what it really boils down to, is encapsulated by those two fundamentally contrasting perspectives on trust and honesty.
Well,
We've looked closely at one culture, primarily the Western low-context model, where being honest, being candid, being explicit, that's generally seen as the way you build relationship trust. You put your cards on the table.
yeah, transparency builds trust.
Well, and then we've examined this other system, the high context model exemplified by Japan, where profound demonstrated trust built carefully over time through shared history, mutual respect shown through actions and silence, that trust must first exist before true personal honesty, the Han, can ever really be safely revealed without causing disruption.
Trust precedes honesty, in a way.
In a very significant way, yes. And the true challenge, I think, for any international organization, for anyone working across these cultural divides, is finding that peaceful, functional middle ground, a place where both systems can be acknowledged, understood, and navigated with, hopefully, profound respect for their very different, deeply rooted definitions of what constitutes sincerity, commitment, and trustworthy communication.